Start with the discussion regarding the video I posted for you on Moodle yesterday, dealing with race and sports. Does anybody have any comments or questions regarding that particular video? It was a TED Talk that was given at the University of Toronto on the Scarborough campus, only in the recent past, actually. Any comments or questions? Abby?
Yeah, I thought it was a really good TED Talk. I liked how he talked about the part when he was talking about, like, is this hockey player just commenting like this because he feels forced to, which I think was interesting, because especially when you have minority seen people in sports, I feel like they're kind of seen as like tokens type of thing, and they're expected to talk about discrimination they may face. So I thought it was good that the presenter acknowledged that that is a thing that goes on.
Absolutely. Shivani?
Oh, so like I found it very alarming because I think he was saying that, oh, when minority groups are like at the front page of a like a type of sports, like white supremacy would like phrase it in a way that, okay, it's because of this, you know, they don't actually like deserve it. So for example, with the whole, you know, I'm from Jamaica, just as the fastest male and female in the world, which is Usain Bolt and Shelley and Fraser Price. So like he was saying that when people from like the Caribbean or from Kenya are on the face of like track events, they're saying that, oh, it's the yam that they're eating or something like that. But growing up in the country, like I used to hear that a lot, where people say, oh, he's fast, he's a fast runner because, you know, the amount of yam and banana he might eat. But I mean, growing up, we don't see it as anything. But watching this video, I realized that there's more to it. Like they're actually phrasing it in a way that, oh, Black people cannot be on top, and it's because of what they're eating while they're, you know, the fastest man or woman. So basically, I see like a true innuendo in a sense where the words might look innocent on its face, but deep down it has a greater meaning.
Yeah, what we're talking about basically, and that you explained it well. It's white privilege, and it's in North America essentially. So, you know, as he was saying, 82% of sports announcers are white. So, you know, what they do when they write these articles about sports is it's from a white perspective, as in white is normal, white is expected to be at the top of their game, and anybody who is minority, obviously, who isn't white, you know, there has to be something different about it, right? Whether it's the food, or, you know, they run in their bare feet, or, you know, whatever it's going to be, you know, that's the perception that there is. And again, it's very much white privilege, you know, in that whites will do fine because that's who they are. That's who that's who they are ingrained to be, the best kind of thing. Anybody else has to have, it's not a gimmick, but it's kind of like that, has to have a way to look at things that you know, or that gives them an advantage that that makes them just that much better, and therefore competitive to white athletes. Anybody else? Jinwan?
Hi, Professor. I have a question, but it's not really related with race, but more with gender. It's also related with our class today. Like, due to the political correctness system in the United States, a person can freely choose which gender he belongs to. But how about if a person is a biological male, but this person claims to be a female in order to get a good ranking in sport competitions and participate in a female competition? Can this person be defined as illegal, or can this be defined as disrespectful for women? This matter is, oh, sorry.
No, no,
This matter has not been popular in the United States for the time yet, but there are some of the typical examples in Thailand. Like there's one person, which is a male kickboxer, but he cannot get in good ranking in the male competition. So he claimed that he is a woman, and he did certain surgeries, but he still kept the man's body. So when he participated in the women's competition, he wins all of them. So many people complain about this situation.
Yeah, the and we're going to talk a little bit more about this tonight, but the general rule of thumb is that if somebody is transgender, and they want to compete in, as their recognized gender, which is different than, the way they were born physically. They have to have been, been changed, had the transgender therapy and or surgery for at least 2 years, and have a rigorous regimen of, if you're transgendering to a woman, of estrogen, and to a man of testosterone. So there are rules in place for that, right? So it is recognized, and if they've comply, if you're transgender and you comply with those rules and regulations, then you can compete accordingly to whatever gender you identify with. Anybody else? Kara?
Yeah, just watching the video, it just kind of brings to light how disappointing some perspectives are. Like, I remember watching the draft. It was a big QB draft this year, and some analysts were analyzing the quarterbacks, and the comments were all pretty the same for the white male, hardworking, came from good family, good work ethic. No issues off the field. And then when they were speaking towards, let's say, Trey Lance or another minority quarterback, it was more so, I don't know if he has the work ethic or if he's has focus, and there's been problems off the field surrounding his family. It's disheartening that there is such a discriminatory perspective around athletes still today, but hopefully with what's been going on this year, that it's starting to change the narrative.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. One of the, and like on that line, I mean, one of the points that the commentator was making in the TED Talk was in baseball, for instance. In baseball, there is concern raised that since Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier 70 years ago now, baseball was very much like football and basketball, in that there was a preponderance of Black athletes, but that's diminished dramatically. There's only, and it astounds me that only 8% of the active players in the MLB now are Black. 4 times that number are now Hispanic. So if you watch any MLB game, there's a game on tonight. The Jays are playing, Miami. The players, most of them are from the Dominican or from Cuba or from Colombia, and that kind of thing. And that interestingly, that has raised concerns amongst the Black community, because their proportionate representation in baseball has gone down. Other thing that's interesting is that nobody complains about the white proportion changing, which it's still a dominantly white sport, although you wouldn't necessarily know that in watching a lot of games. But I mean, having said that, there's a double standard, and that's very clear when you look at that kind of thing. Any other hands up or questions for this? Abby again?
I just wanted to respond to the previous discussion about transgender people in sports. So I read a study that was called Out on the Field, and it was dealing with mainly LGB representation in sports, but it did talk about transgender people a little bit. And not that this isn't a situation that arises, because it definitely is and is becoming more common, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but a lot of this is avoided because people often don't feel safe entering into these situations in sports. So it's just avoided because they don't feel safe playing the sports anyways. So that was a big thing that this study was talking about, was that sports aren't necessarily a safe community for LGBTQ people. So that's why we don't see as many issues with discrimination surrounding that.
That's probably very true. That's a good point. I mean, it is still a very masculinized arena to be in, right? So as much as people like to think that it's a very liberal relationship, with the athletes and the sport, it's really not. It's still very much a testosterone-driven enterprise. Anybody else? Good discussion. Okay, all right, so let's move then to the lecture. So the lecture tonight is based on discrimination, and the first part of the lecture I'm going to give you because I haven't taught a lot of first or second year courses in the last couple of years. I'm going to give you some breakdown on how the laws of discrimination evolved in Canada, and then put that within the context of sports. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution of rights in Canada, so to speak. So, we talk about rights in Canada for four very specific purposes, and hopefully this is recognized widely, is that they reflect the collective conscience of a nation, right? They provide the international community with the basis of standards and fairness and equality. Law enforcement needs to understand them to fulfill their mandate. And it is important to balance the enforcement of democratic rights and the response to things like terrorism, all of which deal with rights. Having said all that, however, from the time of first contact, which in Turtle Island is 400 some odd years, there has been discrimination against marginalized groups in Canada. And for our purposes, and this is more so than in the United States, for instance, there's been an incredibly marginalized and prejudicial treatment of Indigenous Canadians, and that's a function of colonialism and assimilation, and certainly systemic discrimination. Based on the news in the last week, especially with the Kamloops Residential School, who can tell us what was the federal government's primary tool for assimilation for about 150 years in this country? Anybody? What did Canada do as a country to try to make, make Indigenous peoples non-Indigenous, as in fold them into the white society?
Residential schools.
Yeah, Kyle, absolutely right. And that is the number one tool that the Canadian government exercised for almost a century and a half, to take Indigenous children away from their parents at a very young age, and it became compulsory at one period of time, put them into residential schools where their hair was cut, their clothes were changed. They were not allowed to exercise any of the cultural practices that they were used to. Their names were changed to white names. They very seldom went home to see their family, as we know in the last week with the finding of the bones in the Kamloops Residential School site. That very many of them never returned home, to the anguish of their families, obviously. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by a former Senator Murray Sinclair, that is where it was declared that Canada's policy of residential schools, in concert with the major churches that ran those schools, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, which is the church that Shinwak Hall was run by, the Presbyterian Church, those churches and the federal government basically committed cultural genocide, right? And that's now pretty much acknowledged, right? Moving on to that, we have what's called the Chinese head tax. Anybody know what the Chinese head tax involved? Just off the top? Kyle?
And by the way, that wasn't me that answered the last one. I don't know who it was though.
Oh, who answered the last one on, whose voice was that?
I don't know.
I don't know. Okay.
But anyways, it was essentially a tax put on Chinese immigrants coming to Canada to seek work about, I think it was 110 years ago or so.
Yeah, and do you know what the purpose of it was? And here's a copy of what it looked like.
Kind of just to minimize the amount of immigrants that were coming in. It was more of a racist control, population control concept rather than an actual, well, that's how we'd see it today, but.
Well, and it was. That's the. Oh, hang on a second. We have more hands here. Abby.
I think it was because that way, because they had Chinese men coming over to work on the railroad, but then they were kind of hoping that by taxing their families from coming over, it would force them to marry white Canadian women and have children with white Canadian women.
Okay, well, that's a broader answer than is usually the case. But yeah, but you're both right. So what happened obviously was that Sir John A. Macdonald, again, the prime minister who put the residential school system into place, he also, as a function of creating the country, and we talked about this in the class on Canadian law, when he created the country of Canada with the premiers of what became the 4 provinces, it was his goal to build a railway across the country from coast to coast. And that was for the purposes of tying the country together, for acquiring all those lands basically west of Ontario that weren't part of Canada yet, that were owned for the most part by the Hudson's Bay Company, being Rupert Land, and were the Northwest Territories, and it eventually obviously became Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, but to tie them all together with a railway. And that was also, the purpose of that railway was to, get goods, to the peoples in the prairies, and get the return back to the 4 original provinces, were the manufacturing provinces, and most importantly, to as a function of advertising, to get, for the most part, immigrants from the UK, because Canada was very much a British colony when it was established in 1867, to get immigrants from the UK, and then it expanded to the Ukraine and Poland and what have you, to get them to come to Canada and get on the train and go west and inhabit the prairies, right? Which was a vastly wide area of lands that the federal government wanted to see cultivated, and it also created all these consumers for the manufacturers back in Ontario and Quebec and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And in order to build the railway, what Macdonald did is he brought in Chinese workers. Chinese workers, they didn't speak any English. They lived in absolute poverty and squalor. They were paid next to nothing, but they built the railway virtually by hand. They were called, it's incredibly derogatory, but they were called coolies. That's the term that they were called. And by 1885, which means that after about 20 years of construction, because that's after Confederation, to that period of time, the last golden spike went into the railway in British Columbia, into the rail line, and their job was done. And so what Macdonald wanted to do was basically say, you know what, we have these thousands and thousands of Chinese workers here. The last thing we want to do, and this is very much what Kyle was saying, is let their families come here, right? We don't want to in any way encourage their families to come here. Patricia?
I was just gonna say, so wasn't Chinese immigration prohibited after that?
Well, it wasn't prohibited, but it was this head tax that was put in place, and it was $50 a head for anybody who wanted to immigrate. And $50 a head in 1885 might as well have been $100,000 today, right? It was so incredibly expensive that it did, basically stop immigration. Jen Wan?
And the taxes actually accumulated to about $23 million at that time.
Well, it may be, Patricia. I mean, I'm not sure. That's an awfully high number, but it would have been, whatever it was unattainable. Jen Wan, your hand was up?
Yes, sir. I think also there's one of the history background of the situation I have to clarify why those Chinese people have to come to Canada at that time. It's not only Canada, but also American. I think the dates that's the first group of the Chinese labor come to Canada was in 1858. And that's what was 18 years after the Opium War between the Qing dynasty of China and the British Navy. And the Qing dynasty lost the war really hard, though. So they forced by the British have to give Hong Kong to British for 100 years, and they have to open a southern part of China. And due to the loss of the war, and also for the fines that they have to pay to the British government, so that there are more and more people are living a horrible life. So they are living on the poverty, and this is why I think the start is from United States, and then Canada is part of it too. Because some of the business people in United States and Canada think of we need more laborers. So they have to go, and at that time also China, those people, they are kind of refugees, but not refugees. They are cheap and they are working. They have the working ability, and also they are cheap. So they went to the southern part of China, which is my hometown, and told the people over there, said, "Oh, there's a goat in North America. If you guys come with us, you can bring like a few pieces of gold in a few years when you come back. But they didn't realize they don't have a chance to come back anymore. And they didn't know that they have to pay their head tax when they arrived over here.
Right.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Yeah, so the whole point of this obviously was that again, McDonald, in addition to the incredibly racist program of residential schools, he moved right from there into the Chinese head tax and had no problem with that at all, right? And so that was put in place as a function of the end of the railway. The purpose was to stop the Chinese immigration into Canada, and the moral panic. That's a sociological term. Hopefully, some of you have heard of that. The moral panic that the federal conservative government promoted at the time in order to justify this kind of, the halting of all immigration of Chinese immigrants was that they were all dirty Chinese drug users, who basically lived in opium dens. There were cartoons, published in the Vancouver Herald and those kind of things to promote that kind of thing, right? So that's the kind of racist attitude that was taken. Moving forward to the Second World War, we have what is in fact the internment of Japanese Canadians. So if you're not familiar with this, the Second World War, of course, 1939 to 1945. So the Allied forces, which was the UK, United States, they didn't come into 41, Canada, and Russia, basically, the Soviet Union, were the Allied forces against the forces of the Axis powers, which was Germany, Italy, and Japan. So what happened during the Second World War is that the federal government interned Japanese Canadians. These are people who actually were born and bred in Canada, who were actually Canadian citizens by birth. So they took them and put them into camps, internment camps, which are not unlike POW camps. They took all of their real estate, and they owned a lot of real estate in British Columbia. That's where they were fundamentally focused, right? And they did this because, again, the moral panic that these people would somehow spy for enemies of the state, right? They also treated Italian Canadians very poorly, but not to the extent of this. The Italian Canadian community was more solidified in Canada and could push back against this kind of treatment more than certainly the Japanese Canadians could. Anyway, this is just another elementary example of how poorly the federal government behaved and behaved in a very racist manner towards citizens of the country, right? Okay, so what that eventually did, after the end of the Second World War, 1945, it ended. It created an environment for the creation of international human rights legislation, right? It became very, very clear that this was needed. So when the war ended in 1945, the Allied powers who essentially created the United Nations. It was originally proposed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1942 after Japan invaded Pearl Harbor. He suggested that the United Nations should unite together to fight a common cause. But it wasn't until 3 years later, in the end of the Second World War, that it came together. So again, you had the UK, you had the US, you had the UK, you had US, you had Russia again. And you had France actually who joined, and which is kind of odd, only in that France was never a power in the Second World War. They virtually surrendered to Germany very early in the war, but they became the nations that created the United Nations itself. They also became the Security Council at the United Nations. The 5 members of the Security Council that have a permanent vote, and they still do to this day, even though by no stretch of the imagination are those nations now the leading nations in the world, right? But they certainly were in 1945, and that has still continued. And that has compromised the United Nations in all kinds of ways in the 76 years that it's existed. But having said that, the United Nations in 45 said, you know what, we have to come together and we have to create legislation, international legislation that addresses the atrocities. And remember, of course, we had the Holocaust, those kind of things in the Second World War. We need declaration of rights that basically binds all nations in the world to a better future, so that in fact this kind of horror of the Second World War does not take place again. So what happened was, before we get here, in 1948, we had the Declaration of Human Rights basically put in place by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the widow of Franklin Roosevelt, who died as the president of the U.S. At the end of the war. As a part of that, though, as a part of the declaration, 20 years later, we have the United Nations General Assembly, which are the member states of the UN. There's 193 of them currently, who came together and passed two what were considered multilateral treaties. One was called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the other one was the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Okay, and 10 years later, the Canadian government, as a party to the United Nations, they agreed, and so did the provinces at the time, they agreed to accept those two covenants on May 19th, 1976. So what they did is they agreed to, as part of the General Assembly, to these treaties in 1966, and then within 10 years, they actually domestically, right, agreed to them to have authority within the country of Canada, right? And as a function of that, Canada was required as a signatory to the International Covenant to basically provide, pursuant to Article 2.2 of what's called the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to do the following. And what they agreed to do is this: if they hadn't already done so, and this is the same for all nations, if they hadn't already done so, the covenant required them to adopt a constitutional process to bring into effect internally in each country the provisions of the covenant, right? This is 1976, right? This is important because the Prime Minister of Canada at the time was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, right? Justin Trudeau's father, right? And this was the genesis of the Canadian federal government agreeing to create a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, all right? And again, as a function of the covenant, here is what they agreed to put into a future charter, right? Which was only, as it turns out, 6 years later with the Canadian Charter. But in 1976, they agreed to abide by the following. Article 6, they agreed to the preservation of life to be protected, the right from inhuman and degrading treatment, the freedom of slavery and servitude, which didn't apply to Canada, but certainly applied to some nations at that time. They agreed to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention. These are they, as in the citizens of the country, the right to the freedom of liberty of movement, the right to equality before the law, to be presumed innocent before proven guilty. And that's a very common phrase you guys would be familiar with, right? To have a fair and public hearing, the right to be able to vote in a public process, the right to have the legal protection of the law without discrimination, and the right to have religious, ethnic, and linguistic freedoms as minorities. All right, so that was 1976, but let's back up a bit. Let's back up to 1960, all right, because we're going to go back to things that are more related to the end of the Second World War. So in 1960, basically, which is only 15 years after the end of the Second World War, countries and within Canada, provinces were starting to think of ways to address the atrocities of the war. You know, basically the things like the Japanese internment kind of thing. The person who drove that train for the federal government was this guy on the left. Anybody who know who this is? Any Kyle?
Depending on how you look at it, the infamous chief.
The chief, all right. And who's the chief?
Diefenbaker.
That's a good man. All right. So yeah, so John Diefenbaker, the chief, right? He was the prime minister of the country. He was actually the 13th prime minister of the country from 57 to 63. He was a member of parliament during the Second World War. Before that, of course, he was a lawyer in Saskatchewan, and actually apparently quite a good one. So he was a member of the federal government during the Second World War. That was part of that Japanese internment thing. And all records show that Diefenbaker, in fact, regretted that. Right? He was very much a civil libertarian, even though he was a progressive conservative member of parliament. So, basically when he became prime minister, he thought that, he would do something about it. And so what he did was he was the instigator for creating a statutory enactment by the government of Canada called the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960, right? Incredibly important because this was the first first domestic rights instrument that the federal government had ever put in place in Canada. All right, and here's what it said. It's under Section 1, the bill said that everybody should be free from discrimination based on race, national origin, color, religion, or sex, have the rights to life, liberty, security of the person, which should ring a bell with you because that's an exact phrase used in the Charter, the enjoyment of property and the right not to be deprived thereof except due process of law, the right to equality and protection of law, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly and association, the freedom of press. And importantly, here's what the bill did. Remember, though, that this is a federal statute, and it declared that all federal statutes, because its authority was only in the federal jurisdiction, that all federal statutes must be construed and applied in such a way as to protect the freedoms, the rights and freedoms recognized in the Bill of Rights. So what Diefenbaker and his party was saying in 1960 was that the intent is that the federal government will not pass any new laws going forward forever, basically, unless they conform to the Bill of Rights, right? That's a fairly lofty goal. Also, with respect to what's called due process, we had this in the Bill of Rights. Again, the freedom from arbitrary detention, imprisonment, exile, cruel and unusual punishment. A person who's arrested or detained has the right to be informed of the reason for that, and the right to retain and instruct counsel, the right to be brought before a judge within a certain time after arrest, basically. A court cannot compel a person to give evidence against themselves. That's the rule against self-incrimination. The right to a fair trial, the right to reasonable bail. Again, the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. We already saw that a few minutes ago, right? But again, there were limitations to the Bill of Rights. Because it was a federal act or legislation, it only applied to federal law, which simply means this, that the federal government, any future federal government after 1960 could override its provisions, right, by simply, amending legislation or repealing it or doing whatever it can, to change it, if that was the will of Parliament. Since it was not entrenched in a constitution, and it couldn't be. The only way it could be entrenched in a constitution is if it was embedded in the British North America Act of 1867, which is the only constitutional document we had. And the problem with that, of course, is that that was a statute of the British Parliament, right? And Diefenbaker, under no circumstances, was going to go cap in hand to London to ask for British politicians to amend the Canadian Constitution. That just was not going to happen, right? As a function of all that, however, because it was a statute and not a constitutional document, then courts were reluctant to give it a very broad application, right? Having said that, however, the Canadian Bill of Rights is still the law in Canada, notwithstanding the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which now constitutionally protects human rights, certainly more broadly than the Bill of Rights, right? And is a constitutional document. Having said that, however, the Canadian Bill of Rights still does this. It protects the right to the enjoyment of property and the right to a fair hearing for the determination of rights. That first point, the right to protection of property, is particularly not contained in the Charter. That's a really important point. For whatever reason, Trudeau and Jean Chrétien, who was his Minister of Justice at the time of the Charter, they just did not want to see that in the Charter of Rights, even though it was in the Bill of Rights, and before that, the Universal Declaration of Rights, all right? So let's watch, here's a bit of a historical pick for you of human rights.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Oh, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal, human,
The rights that humans have?
That's a very large debate.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, una domanda complicatissima.
Guess we just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet declaring their independence. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded, but the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers. Free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent. Who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
Okay. So, at the same time that we're looking back at the Canadian Bill of Rights in the 1960s, the provinces as well were looking at doing it themselves in their own sphere of authority. So by the 1960s and during that decade, most provinces had human rights legislation in place. Their human rights legislation, again, dealing with what's relevant to a province, again, prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, and ethnic origin. The prohibition of discrimination was aimed towards, and again, this is because they're provincial, aimed towards the availability of accommodation and services regarding where you worked, the wages you earned, and where you could, where your accommodation was, and where you could eat. Those are the kind of things that provinces had jurisdiction over. More recently, the human rights in provinces have been extended to provide discrimination against things like sexual harassment by superiors and fellow workers in the context of employment. What we have in Ontario is this. It's called the Ontario Human Rights Code. RSO means the Revised Statutes of Ontario of 1990. The reason it's so old, as in over 30 years ago, is that this is the last time that the revised statutes were actually put into hard copy, into writing, because at that time we didn't openly have the web, we didn't have the internet to update searches for statutes and what have you. So every year you would have the revised statutes, and then in 1991 there would have been the Statutes of Ontario, 1991, and then the Statutes of Ontario, 1992. Every year you kind of get the drift. And then in 2000, there would have been the revised Statutes of Ontario of 2000. But what happened between 1990 and then was, of course, the internet. All right, and so what happened is in the 1990s is that instead of looking at a hard copy of all the statutory enactments that are brought into place, on a continuous basis by either the Parliament of Canada or in Ontario by the Legislative Assembly, you could just go online. And going online, you could search a statute and you would get its most recent version, right? What a great tool that is. Trust me, for the first 20 years I practiced, that wasn't available. If you were going to basically look at what the law was on a particular issue, you had to go to a library, you had to look up a revised statute. So if it was something that happened in the 1980s, I'd have to look at the RSO's 1980s. And if it was 1987, I'd have to go through the SOs 81, 82, 83 to 87, right? And find what the law was that way. Now, with a click, you can go to Canly or LexisNexis or what have you, academia, and you can find the current issue of a statute that comes up almost instantaneously. So it's a tremendous, tremendous thing that's available now. So here's what the Ontario Human Rights Code now protects: age, ancestry, color, race, ethnic origin, creed. Anybody know what creed is? It's religion. It's a form of religion. Disability, family status, marital status, gender identity, gender expression, receipt of public assistance, and sexual orientation. I guarantee you that when Ontario in the 1960s created the grounds for discrimination to be protected against, it did not include gender identity, expression, or sexual orientation. Because this is a provincial statute, it's not a constitutional document, it's simply a statute. It's relatively easy for the province to change the grounds. They don't require constitutional amendments, they just require new statutes, right? And so that's why things like gender identity, expression, and orientation can be kept current in a document protecting those against discrimination. So that's a really good thing, all right? The protected areas, again, because it's provincial legislation, are things like accommodation and housing, employment services, and things you belong to for things like voluntary associations and unions. You got to remember that the provinces can only pass laws, that includes human rights laws, within whatever Section 92 of the Constitution Act of 1867 allows it to do. Just like the federal government can only pass laws that Section 91 of that same statute allows, right? So yeah, it's really important to keep those in mind. Ontario human rights system, in fact, now has 3 separate components to it. They each operate together, but also independently of each other. You have the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission, right? So the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario decides if someone's human rights have been violated. So this is where you go if you think that you've been discriminated against based on one of those grounds in the Ontario Human Rights Code that's set out that we just went through, right? This is where you actually bring an application to the tribunal. So this is a public tribunal. This is a tribunal operated by the province of Ontario. Remember, we talked about last day in the class before about how athletic leagues and organizations, sports organizations themselves are private tribunals, right? Well, this is a public tribunal. The tribunal will decide how to deal with your complaint. Basically, it may decide that your rights have been violated, and it will help you get a remedy for that. Or it may tell you that, in fact, that your particular complaint doesn't fall within the grounds enumerated in the Ontario Human Rights Code. All right, and if that's the case, you'll have to look for your remedy somewhere else. We also have what's called the Human Rights Legal Support Center, which is really a form of legal aid for those who are seeking to enforce their human rights. So what this does is this provides assistance. They have lawyers on staff that will help people make applications under the Ontario Human Rights Code if they don't have the funds to hire a lawyer themselves to do it. Okay, so it's a useful tool. And lastly, we have the Ontario Human Rights Commission. This is a policy-making body that identifies the root causes of discrimination and brings about changes in order to address them. It doesn't deal with individual complaints. That's what the tribunal does. This commission is the one. This is the commission, for instance, in the 1990s or the 2000s that would have recommended to the province of Ontario, please change the grounds of discrimination to include transgender issues, sexual identity, and orientation. Right? This is the body that would have made those recommendations. Right? So it's a very useful body to exist. All right. In 1977, the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Canadian Human Rights Code was put in place to do exactly the same thing as the Ontario Human Rights Code, but with respect to issues within the federal sphere. Right? But now, more importantly than all of that, is of course the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? And so the Canadian Charter was enacted in 1982. It was part of the patriation of the Canadian Constitution from the United Kingdom, right, as a function of the Constitution Act of 1982 and the Canada Act of 1982. So what happened was that the Charter was built into that process, and it's really important that it was done at that time because it constitutionalized the Charter, which means, of course, that it stands above and beyond anything that a parliament can do by way of a legislative statute. It's a constitutional document. So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms basically is there. It deals with the dealings of governments. So it does not extend to relationships between individuals. So this is really important because if you have a complaint, for instance, against me as your professor, I've somehow discriminated against you, right? Well, I'm not, it's a gray area because universities are government bodies, but say it was your boss at work. Say your boss at work discriminated against you. You wouldn't have a charter claim against them. You would have an Ontario human rights claim against them in an employment context. All right. So it's really important to remember that that's what the charter does. It only extends its protections when government, this is both provincial, territorial, and federal governments, have done something wrong. Okay, so the individual provincial human rights codes deal with individual complaints within the boundaries of a province. The greatest thing the charter has done is with respect to the supremacy of parliament, right? Which simply means this: prior to the charter, we had our entire federal governmental system was based on the supremacy of parliament, in that nothing had more authority than the federal government sitting in as a parliament in Ottawa. All 338 members of parliament who are elected across the country, they had the supreme power to make laws that affect everybody in the country. What the charter did is that it made that supremacy of parliament subservient to the terms of the charter itself. So what it did is it basically took us from being a supreme parliamentary regime to a constitutional democracy, right? Which simply means this, that federal government cannot make laws, or provinces for that matter, cannot make laws with some exceptions dealing with, parts of the charter that we may talk about, that with very little exception, provinces and federal government cannot make laws that do not abide by the terms of the charter. There's a notwithstanding clause that allows them to vary from that, but that's very, very rarely put in place. So here are the sections of the charter. Now, keep in mind, when we look to the charter, keep in mind, the sections of the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights we talked about, and we talked about the terms in the Canadian Bill of Rights, and likewise, things that are protected in human rights codes. Think about this, because the charter again only came about as a function of Canada and the provinces agreeing to incorporate constitutionally the terms of the International Covenant in 1976. That's what Pierre Trudeau agreed to do, right? And the charter was a result of this. So, clearly what the charter is the satisfaction of the Article 2, Sub 2 requirement of the covenant to constitutionalize human rights. Human rights initially found going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights put in place after the Second World War in 1948. The war ended in 45. So what Section 1 says this: The Charter guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in the Charter, subject to such reasonable limits prescribed by law, demonstratively justified in a free and democratic society. Okay, that's really important because that ties into Section 7, which is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So if anybody feels that their Section 7 right has been breached, right, and a court finds it's been breached, it will remedy that breach unless Section 1 saves it in that that breach can be justified as a reasonable limit prescribed by law. Okay, Section 2, and again, these are the kind of things you're going to recognize. Everyone has the right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, opinion, freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association. Those freedoms are not absolute. For instance, hate speech, is not a constitutionally protected form of expression.
What is hate speech? And should the government ban it? We asked college students at the University of Southern California.
If somebody uses a racial slur, that's hate speech? Yeah.
I think that would be a reason to, like a crime.
What if somebody says Muslims shouldn't be allowed into the U.S.?
Yeah, that's hate speech.
What if somebody denies the Holocaust?
No, I don't have any understanding for that. You shouldn't be able to blatantly lie about something, especially like the Holocaust.
A female comedian says men are scum.
I don't believe that's hate speech.
All white people are racist.
No, I would say no.
I don't know.
The First Amendment grants absolute protection of even the most vile speech, so long as it doesn't directly incite violence.
I hate white people. All of them. Every last iota of a cracker, I hate it.
But is the tide turning in America? 40% of Americans now believe the government should regulate so-called hate speech. But it turns out that defining hate speech is easier said than done.
Everyone thinks this is hate speech, this is hate speech.
Many who advocate hate speech laws in 2018 seem motivated by what they see as the rise of Trumpism.
Build that wall.
And hateful rhetoric on the right. And college campuses have become the epicenter of the free speech debate, with incidents of college students shouting down and even physically attacking controversial speakers becoming an increasingly common occurrence. So we talked to students at the University of Southern California about free speech and hate speech. One common refrain on campus is that hateful speech is actually equivalent to violence.
Do you think hate speech by itself is an act of violence?
I do.
Yes. You know?
Your words can't physically harm someone.
I think violence is more than physical, it's emotional, psychological.
If hate speech is violence, maybe it makes sense to regulate it like Canada, Australia, and most of Europe do. Many of the students we spoke to seemed open to the idea.
I think if people could understand the power of words, then maybe hate speech as violence could help us have restrictions that are not damaging or that could stop at a certain place.
Those kind of opinions are better said, left unsaid, because it just incites violence and hatred among everyone,
Are you in favor of regulations that would stop people from doing that or that would make that a crime?
Yeah.
I would have no problem if it is regulated.
But then who determines what constitutes hate speech? While most respondents to a recent poll agreed that hate speech is immoral, 82% said it would be difficult to ban because people can't agree on what is hateful.
Could people form a consensus around whether these things are hate speech?
Definitely not.
I think it would be really hard to agree.
And so does that give you pause and make you think maybe the regulation would not do what I would hope it would do?
Yeah.
Obviously that would be ideal if something like that could be into place. I just don't really see how it would be.
So I'll give you an example. So there was a French comedian and he was jailed for an anti-Semitic joke. Would you support that type of action?
No.
Advocates of hate speech laws often say that racists cloak themselves in the veil of free speech to attack vulnerable populations.
Having free speech is a great right for everyone, but when the more powerful have it, it's going to obviously work to their advantage more than the less powerful.
But social media provides examples of how speech codes often backfire and hurt the very minorities they are intended to protect. Facebook and Twitter are private companies free to ban whatever they deem to be hate speech, but their attempts to do so have resulted in bans of feminists saying that all white men are trash, and the platform suspended rapper Lil B for posting that white people are the only ones who really love their guns. You can tell they are violent people. Hateful speech might be hurtful, stupid, or just plain wrong, but if we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to hear it, we also lose the opportunity to rebut it, and the person who's willing to speak forbidden words gains a special power. When Austria imprisoned historian David Irving for Holocaust denial, he was greeted with a hero's welcome by a crowd of 10,000 in Budapest shortly after his release. The government had turned him into a martyr. In America, attempts to shut down or shout down speakers have almost certainly backfired as well, by boosting the visibility of provocateurs like Milo Yiannopoulos.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Trump saying any of these things should definitely be regulated because he has so much influence in him saying these in speeches and stuff.
Trump saying things about minorities like Hispanics and women and Muslims.
Does it concern you that if the government is the one that's regulating these things, that people like Trump would be the one deciding what is protected speech and what is not?
Yeah, of course, that's another concern.
Granting the government the power to decide what's acceptable to say presumes that what brings us closer to the truth is not the free exchange of ideas, but the wise decision-making of politicians. And many of the college students we spoke to agreed that being exposed to challenging and even threatening ideas is an important aspect of the intellectual journey.
And what do you think about people shutting down speakers on campuses?
I don't like that at all. Honestly, I follow a lot of what goes on at Berkeley, where they like protest and not have these far-right speakers come. I think that's dangerous, to be perfectly honest.
Here at USC and on college campuses, it's important that we hear everything we possibly can, whether that be something that we don't like or something that rubs us the wrong way. I think it's important that we hear it because we're going to go out into the world and we're going to hear it there, and it's important that we're able to hear it here and form our own opinions and our own ideas.
Okay, so now we're going to just capture the rest of the charter and then move into the sports context. So Section 3 gives everybody in Canada the right to vote, and the House of Commons basically has to have membership from Canadian citizens for that purpose. The legal rights, which are called the due process rights, basically deal with Sections 7 to 14. So these are really, really important rights if you're charged with a crime. This is the mainstay of your defense against the monumental strength of the state in prosecuting you. So Section 7 gives you the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. There are all kinds of legal due process rights contained in Section 7. For instance, things like you're entitled to have full disclosure of the prosecution's case before you go to trial. Section 15 is the equality section. So again, this will twig with you with respect to everything we talked about earlier, the Canadian Bill of Rights, the International Covenant, what have you. So everyone under Section 15.1 has the right to be free from discrimination for race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability. All right, so look at that carefully, because if you read that, and that's the wording of the charter as of today, right? Because it hasn't changed since 1982, right? What's missing in there? And I don't, that's rhetorical, because what's missing in there is everything we just talked about under what has been added to the Ontario Human Rights Code, things against freedom against discrimination based on sexual identity, transgender expression, and what have you, right? And so, is the charter out of date? Well, if you looked at it on the face of it, that would be a pretty good assumption. So what's happened as a function of that is the Supreme Court of Canada, in reading the charter, has read it as if it's a living tree. That's an expression that's used. It's a living tree in that when it was created in 1982, there's the trunk of the tree, right? And as time goes by and norms change in society from year to year, the tree grows and it branches out in various directions. And so provisions in the charter can grow just like society grows, right, without necessarily having to change it. So what the Supreme Court has done over the years is that it has, in fact, it's a function of decisions that come before it. Actually, it's called reading in. So they've read into Section 15 protection against discrimination based upon all of those things we talked about in the Human Rights Code, protection against discrimination because you're transgender or if your sexual identity or expression or what have you, right? So they are all still every bit as protected as the Ontario Human Rights Code does, but it's a function of the common law, which you guys now are familiar with, okay? 15.2 is an interesting, interesting paragraph, because what this says is the following. Everything in 15.1, all those protections against, the discrimination therein, does not apply for the benefit of those who are historically disadvantaged by discrimination. Does anybody understand what that means? It's called reverse discrimination. It's also called benign discrimination. And in the United States, it's called affirmative action. Anybody know what that is? Okay, what this is, I'll give you an example. Affirmative action, the Black rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. So affirmative action back then was this. If two men, we're not going to get into a gender issue, if two men, one black, one white, applied for a job, and they both had the same credentials for that job, then affirmative action would dictate that the employer would hire the black man. Right? Well, that's clearly discriminatory against the white man who has the same credentials. Right? So the hiring is not based on merit, it's based on race. Right? So that's a racial determination for the job. Right? But the black man has been historically disadvantaged because of his race. Right? And that's where this section 15.2 comes into play. Right? So if you have been historically disadvantaged because of your race, then the charter enables employers and whoever else deals with charter issues to look past that and in fact overcome that historical disadvantage by giving advantages to those with race, to the prejudice of those who have been traditionally the ones who have been racist. Right? Hopefully I didn't make that sound as complicated as it is, but hopefully that's straightforward. It's called reverse discrimination, and what it does, it advances the interests of those who have been traditionally disadvantaged. Section 24 deals with the enforcement of the charter. There are two sections in 24, subsection 24.1. This is the section simply that you use if you want to bring a lawsuit against somebody for a breach of the charter. Right? So that's all that says, is that anyone whose rights or freedoms as guaranteed by the charter have been infringed, then they can apply to a court of competent jurisdiction to obtain a remedy for that breach. Right? Section 27 basically affirms that Canada is a multicultural state, essentially, and the charter is to be interpreted on that basis. It's a very broad provision. All right. And now we'll turn to rights and discrimination in sport. So all of that, and remember, this goes back to our very first class where I told you that there isn't any specific law of sports. The law of sports is a combination of all different kinds of substantive areas of law within the sporting context. And so, the first almost 70 slides of tonight's lecture has given you that substantive context. Here's the law of discrimination based on human rights and the charter and what have you. Now, let's see how we apply it to sports themselves. All right. So the question obviously becomes, when is a rule or a policy or a program within a sports organization discriminatory? And again, discriminatory based upon the substantive law that we've just talked about. So sports can take place in all of these places. They can take place in schools, both public schools and private schools, colleges and universities. Canada is almost entirely public university sector, but there are private universities. Quest is a private university in Canada, that kind of thing. You can have sports activities in municipal recreation programs, municipalities being a level of government, right? It can take place in private clubs. There's private golf clubs, private tennis clubs, all those kind of things. They're totally private. Their membership is restricted usually. It takes place in just regular teams and any number of kinds of leagues. And it can take place in provincial, national, and international sport governing bodies. And of course, here we're talking about the Pan Am Games and the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics. So all of those various venues, for lack of a better term, are where sports activities can take place. So what you have to do is, if you're being discriminated against, in any one of those individual places, you have to determine, well, what's my remedy? Where do I go for it? Do I go to the province, and that would be the Ontario Human Rights Code? Do I go, is it a provincial or federal matter so that it brings the charter into play? What do I have? Do I even have to go back to the Canadian Bill of Rights, which is still in effect? These kind of things are applicable. All right. So again, the charter applies to government action only, right? So sports activities run by governments, including public school programs, are subject to the charter. Municipal recreation programs are subject to the charter because municipalities are creatures of provinces. So provinces create municipalities. So for instance, the province of Ontario, I can't tell you when, but there's a provincial statute somewhere called the City of Sault Ste. Marie Act. It created the actual city of Sault Ste. Marie. Before that, there would have been the Town of Sault Ste. Marie Act, right? Both of those being provincial statutes. So the charter applies in that particular arena. However, it doesn't apply to private schools, to private clubs, again, professional leagues and teams, right? So again, for instance, if you're concussed in an NFL game and you're concussed because the coach sends you out and it doesn't protect you from the damage of a concussion, right? You don't have a charter claim. You just don't. Universities and colleges are not considered government run. So there is some common law that goes back and forth on this, but that's why I said a few minutes ago, if you were going to come after me for discriminating against you in my class because I'm a professor and therefore an employee of the university, did you have a charter challenge? The bulk of the authority says no, although again, there has been exceptions to it. Provincial and national sports organizations are not considered government run, even though the Pan Am Games and what have you, and the Commonwealth Games are large organizations that certainly have government influence in them, right? They're organizations unto themselves, so they would not be subject to charter challenge, right? Human rights legislation, again, the federal government in 1977 and every province in the 1960s has put in place human rights legislation and human rights codes, all right? So is there jurisdiction to apply? That's the question you have to ask. So human rights applies to every organization offering services to the public. Okay, so you got to remember, we're not dealing with the charter claim, but now a human rights claim. So it applies to services to the public. How do you define the public, right? So even though there are specific entrance requirements to belong to an organization, as long as the public can apply, HR applies. That's a very, very broad test. That means that, it almost applies everywhere within provincial jurisdiction because, unless it's very exclusively only open to a very small sector of, the public, so that it's no longer as in the public, but private, then you could apply, right? So universities and colleges allow applications to the public, so therefore the Ontario Human Rights Code applies. So if I do discriminate against you in my class, you may want to bring a charter challenge, but your better recourse would be under the Ontario Human Rights Code, all right? Proving a claim of discrimination requires 4 things, right? So 1 is the impugned or the violation in an activity included in the act being the Ontario Human Rights Code, right? Is the impugned activity, i.e. the violation, available to the public? It goes back to a couple of slides ago. Is there discrimination in the carrying out of that activity? And is that discrimination based upon a prohibited ground? So you remember, about half an hour ago, I took you through the areas of discrimination in the Ontario Human Rights Code. That was that list that started with you can't discriminate in sex, race, religion, and went down to the further amended, gender identity and expression kind of things. If you are going to be discriminated against, it has to fall within that rubric of grounds, right? So the first question is the impugned activity in the act as in the code? So therefore, does it involve the provision of a service, a facility, or an accommodation, right? And the reason for this, again, is because it has to be within a provincial jurisdiction, right? And the province has authority over the provision of services, facilities, and including employment and accommodation, okay? The provision of a sport activity is a service, so the first question is answered in the affirmative. Is the impugned activity available to the public, right? Well, we just talked about that a few seconds ago about the jurisdiction, whether it's private or public, all right? Is there discrimination in the carrying on of an activity? And if you read the materials for tonight, on page 97 is the case of Andrews versus the Law Society of British Columbia, right? So basically you have to see whether the discrimination is actually defined as discrimination under the code, right? And importantly, is the discriminatory activity based upon a prohibited ground. So if you look to table 6.2 on page 99, I'm just going to go to it. You don't have to look to it. If you have it in front of you, please do. But, you know, there's a really, really good table at 6.2. And what this has is across the top is all the jurisdictions, so the federal government and then all the provinces and territories on the top, and then down the left-hand side are all the grounds of prohibited discrimination. So what you would see there, you know, and then an X in a box on this grid basically identifies in which jurisdiction is which discriminated ground protected against, right? And you'll see that there's lots of areas in here where there's X's and lots of boxes where there aren't. And where there aren't simply means that in that particular jurisdiction, if there's no X in the box, if you go to the left, that particular grounds of discrimination is not protected against, right? And you'll see that it's different for every province, territory, and the federal government. So it's incredibly important when you file a claim under the Ontario Human Rights Code, for instance, that you know in Ontario what in fact is protected. All right, so for instance, in Ontario, there's disobedient dependence on alcohol is not a protected grounds. A pardon conviction is not a protected ground, whereas in British Columbia, it is a protected ground. So that's really important for employment. So if you have a criminal record, right, and you haven't obtained a pardon for it, it's not called a pardon anymore, it's called a record suspension. But in Ontario, employers can use that against you. They do not have to hire you if you have a record. If you are applying, however, for a job in British Columbia, employers cannot ask you if you have a criminal record, right? So those are the kinds of differences there are from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. All right, the most common grounds for discrimination in sports are sex, age, disability, and place of origin and citizenship. So those are the recognized grounds over the course of the common law as they've been assessed under the various provincial human rights codes. So for instance, for sex, as in gender, actually, girls can now play on boys' teams, right? And discrimination based upon gender and or sex includes gay rights, gender identification, transgender, and transsexual identification. So those are now protected grounds. Now, this goes back to the question, I forgot who we're talking about. This was Genwan at the beginning of the class. To be protected against discrimination based upon transgender or transsexual identification, here's what's have taken place to be protected. There must have been gender reassignment surgery. There must have been legal recognition of their assigned gender. That'd be by some authority, more than likely the province in which it takes place. And there must have been 2 years of hormone therapy, again, either estrogen or testosterone. Right? You need to have gone through this regime if you want to be protected against discrimination under the human rights legislation. All right, here's a short video. the next video is going to be on Phelan Fox, which is really groundbreaking as an MMA fighter. So we're going to watch this, and then we're almost done.
I find myself talking to myself as I walk around the house, explaining my positions to myself, you know, because I have to be able to express myself to people because it's such a complicated issue. You know, playing devil's advocate with myself to try and have to express myself to everyone. It's very, very hard. It's like a 24-hour thing, you know, because I know there's a possibility that people are gonna come after me. They're not gonna understand, so I have to be ready, you know, like, it's like MMA, be ready.
When I came out, the biggest misconception was probably that I was cheating, which is crazy because I came out as a transgender male, meaning that I had no surgeries and I took no hormones. My birth sex is female. I was playing on a female team. How am I cheating?
Some people believe I have an automatic advantage over other female MMA fighters. So they think that, like, well, she has to be stronger because she used to be a male. But if they look into the science of it and what the hormones do to the body, to the male body once taken over a period of time, I believe it's from like 1 year to 2 years.
2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years, yeah. It dissipates. And that's what they found, which is one of the reasons why the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has allowed post-operative trans people to participate in the Olympics. When I'm in the ring, do I ever think about sex? Believe me, sex or anything of that nature is the last thing on my mind. And I don't think any fighter is thinking about that. If they do, they're gonna not have such a great sparring session, especially if they're dealing with me. Do I ever regret transition? Hell no. It was the best thing I've ever done with my body and my life, and it actually saved my life.
It's kind of saddening to hear that, you know, that she was like thinking about committing suicide. Because I don't know what I'd do without her. Not many people could do what she's doing, and I'm proud of her for that. Makes me really happy that that she is where she is now and that she's gonna help a whole bunch of people.
She's the last person on Earth that would ever be with a man. Period.
You have to take it there, huh?
Just saying.
Yeah, I am okay. I guess that would help the answer. I've never been attracted to men. I have never been with men. I have never dated men. No disrespect to men. It's just, I truly am a lesbian and not bisexual at all. And like I said, you know, when Fallon told me that she was trans, it was nothing to me. It was absolutely nothing because she is a woman and she's a beautiful woman, and that's all there is to it.
I don't feel like I have several people in my life, you know, like, well, why am I fighting this fight? Why not just like take the easy route out and just like give up? That's not me. That's not within me. Like, that's not who I am. I'm a fighter. Like, you know, that would just be like they say, it's like how when they made me like this. My coaches built me this way. Like, never take the easy way out. You fight until the fight's done. You fight until it's the end. And that's what I'm doing. I'm gonna fight until the end. I'm not gonna quit, so I'm not gonna take the easy route out. Like, doing that would just be giving up. And I'm not gonna do that.
Okay, again, back to the common areas of discrimination. So gender certainly was the first. Age is it an area where it's protected to a great degree, whereas most human rights legislation or codes limit applications to an age of majority, which means that this is again a human rights code that will basically not allow underage athletes to participate. So there is a protection regarding discrimination for the athletes themselves that does limit participation. And sometimes they limit applications to upper age as well. So, if you're over a certain age, sports can limit the age of participation as well, and human rights won't overturn that. Disability, so basically there has to be a reasonable accommodation made that does not cause undue hardship, which basically means that if you come into a sport and you need an accommodation, you're entitled to it. All right, and Sports Canada has policies for initiatives to allow the full participation of persons with disabilities in sports. Place of origin and citizenship. So most human rights codes do not include these as prohibited grounds, so there's no protection in that regard. We have a case, it's in your text. It's called the Sahun versus Atlantic College Athletic Association. It's at the University of New Brunswick. And what their policy was that they limited the number of non-Canadians on a soccer team to 1 in 6. All right, any idea why they would do that? Why would a university soccer team do that? And by the way, it wasn't found to be discriminatory. Essentially because they didn't want to have so many players in the team who were better at the game than essentially most of the Caucasian players were, right? So these would be players that weren't necessarily Caucasian. And again, we have affirmative action programs. We talked about that earlier, where they're supported on the basis to overcome systemic disadvantages. And this is why, for instance, why women's teams can deny participation by men on their teams, but men cannot deny participation by women. Again, that's a function if it's in the federal sphere of 15.2 of the charter. All right, guys, so that's the lecture. So there we go. So what we're gonna do now is go to the breakout rooms. So again, I'll break you into 3 groups and give you 10 minutes or so for the questions, and see you back here then.